I have only been analyzing the brutal front lines of professional tennis for a short time. I am like a newly drafted conscript, just 3 months out of training camp. I do not have 25 years of deep-seated nostalgia blinding me to how this massive machine actually operates. So when I look at the official daily schedule for the Italian Open in Rome, Italy, I see it exactly for what it is. The tournament directors sent Alex Eala a very clear, mathematical warning. You are a qualifier. You belong on the absolute fringes of this battlefield. But they completely underestimated what happens when the actual demographic reality of a city decides to send a physical warning back. Stay with me here, because the standard coverage of this event missed the core tension entirely. Most people watching the broadcast simply assume that court assignments at a massive tournament are just random logistical necessities. They think the organizers in Italy simply ran out of premium space and tossed the lower-ranked athletes wherever they could find an open net. But I have learned very quickly that in the hyper-competitive, deeply stratified ecosystem of professional tennis, absolutely nothing is left to random chance. Let me break down the environment, because you have to understand the specific physical space we are dealing with. The Italian Open, held at the historic Foro Italico in Rome, Italy, is not a minor, developmental event. It is a premier Masters 1000 tournament. It is one of the most physically punishing, high-stakes arenas on the entire European clay court swing. When the official order of play was released, Alex Eala, a young competitor representing the Philippines, was scheduled to play her qualification match on one of the smallest, most remote outside courts on the tournament grounds. Eala did not arrive in Italy with the luxury of a protected high ranking. She arrived as a qualifier. In the strict, unyielding chain of command of the Women's Tennis Association, a qualifier is the lowest rank on the battlefield. You do not get the massive locker rooms. You do not get the premium, isolated practice times. You are forced to survive the grueling, exhausting preliminary trenches just to earn the temporary right to stand on the same dirt as the established elite. You have to fight through a bracket of desperate athletes just to become a recognizable name on the main draw. At the Foro Italico, the physical space is strictly divided by this hierarchy. The main stadium courts are colossal structures. They are built with thousands of stadium seats, engineered for primetime international television broadcasts, and designed to comfortably host the highly ranked, heavily sponsored top 10 players. But the outside courts, where Alex Eala was stationed, are entirely different. They are cramped. They are bordered by simple metal fences and temporary public walkways. They offer almost zero structural seating for spectators. When the tournament directors placed a qualifier from the Philippines on that specific, heavily restricted patch of dirt, they were making a calculation based strictly on the official rankings. They looked at her point total, evaluated her status, and assigned her a physical space that mathematically reflected her low position in the tennis hierarchy. The popular understanding is that the organizers were simply dealing with a crowded schedule and did the best they could with the available grounds. That is not pure logistics. That is a strict enforcement of the established order. By pushing her to the absolute outer perimeter of the facility, the tournament was explicitly telling her how much physical space and attention she was mathematically authorized to command. That is a warning from the system. But the system relies entirely on the assumption that nobody will show up to watch a qualifier on an outside court. They calculate the ranking points, but they do not calculate the kinetic power of human demographics. And as we are about to see, when you try to restrict the physical space of a player who carries the weight of the Philippines into the heart of Italy, the structural integrity of those metal fences is going to be severely tested. To understand the true severity of this situation, you have to look past the highly romanticized version of professional tennis that the governing bodies sell to the television public. The Women's Tennis Association heavily promotes a narrative of pure, open meritocracy. The story they tell is simple. Win your matches, earn your ranking points, and you will eventually climb the ladder to glory. But as a newcomer analyzing the actual mechanics of the tour, the physical reality on the ground at a Masters 1000 event is jarring. It operates much less like a meritocracy, and much more like a brutal, unyielding caste system. The center of the venue at the Italian Open, the massive sweeping arenas like Campo Centrale, is strictly reserved for the tennis aristocracy. If you are a top 10 player, a proven Grand Slam champion, the system automatically grants you an expansive, premium physical space. You get the wide-angle broadcast cameras capturing your every move, the sprawling private locker rooms, and a colossal stadium infrastructure that physically isolates you and elevates you above the chaos of the walking public. But if you are a qualifier like Alex Eala, arriving from the Philippines with a ranking far outside the established elite, the system actively and aggressively pushes you to the periphery. The tournament directors in Rome did not place her preliminary match on a small, tightly fenced-in outside court by accident or oversight. In the highly calculated, deeply scrutinized logistics of professional tennis, your court assignment is a direct, mathematical reflection of your perceived commercial value. That is not just scheduling, that is a warning. The tennis ecosystem is structurally designed to constantly remind lower-ranked players of their exact, subordinate place in the hierarchy. By placing Eala on the absolute edge of the Foro Italico grounds, the organizers were sending a very clear, institutional message. You have not yet earned the right to command attention. You have not accumulated the required ranking points to justify a grandstand or a dedicated television crew. The system actively uses physical space as a tool for suppression. They want the qualifiers out of the main sightlines, away from the premium sponsors, battling it out in the literal dirt, where the casual, high-paying fans are unlikely to wander. Think about the sheer psychological weight of that environment. You are a young athlete representing an entire developing tennis nation, and the premier tournament in Italy tells you to go play your match next to a public walkway. You are assigned a court with virtually zero structural seating. There are no towering bleachers, just a few scattered rows of temporary benches and a simple chain-link fence separating your baseline from the passing foot traffic. You are fighting for your professional life inches away from people who are just walking by looking for a concession stand. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. The generous reading here is that a massive tournament with hundreds of early round matches simply has to utilize every single available square inch of its facility. The logistics of the sport dictate that you simply cannot put every single preliminary match on a show court. But the less generous reading, and the one that actually reflects the cold, corporate reality of the tour, is that the governing bodies intentionally use this restriction of physical space to maintain an iron grip on the tournament's narrative. If they give an unseated qualifier a massive stage, the system risks the embarrassment of empty seats if nobody shows up. So, the system preemptively shrinks the stage. The tournament directors looked at Eala's ranking, looked at her status as a qualifier, and calculated that she would only draw a handful of family members and a few passing spectators. They built an environment strictly based on what the algorithm told them to expect. They restrict the physical space, hoping to restrict the noise. But here is the thing. When you build a barrier to restrict someone's movement, you have to accurately calculate the sheer weight of what is going to push against it. The tournament directors at the Italian Open calculated the strict mathematics of the Women's Tennis Association flawlessly. They knew exactly how many ranking points Alex Eala had to her name. But the secret revelation that the official coverage completely missed is that the organizers entirely forgot to look at the census data of their own city. If you step away from the massive, heavily guarded grandstands of Campo Centrale and walk out to the absolute fringes of the Foro Italico, the visual reality of that preliminary match was stunning. The tournament had assigned Eala to a cramped, severely restricted physical space. There were barely any structural seats. There was just a narrow public walkway, a simple metal chain-link fence, and a sliver of clay. The system expected silence. The system expected a handful of wandering tourists and passing coaches. Instead, thousands of Filipino citizens living and working across Italy descended on that specific patch of ground. This is the core tension that nobody is really talking about. The people pressing themselves against that metal fence were not there to watch a standard tennis qualification match. They were not analyzing her first serve percentage or tracking her entry-level WTA points. They were there entirely because of the flag printed next to her name. Italy is home to a massive overseas Filipino diaspora. And when one of their own steps onto a premier European stage, they do not care if the system has mathematically labeled her a mere qualifier. They do not care about the aristocratic hierarchy of professional tennis. That is not a traditional tennis crowd. That is a localized force of nature. And this is exactly where the system's brutal calculations spectacularly backfired. By pushing Alex Eala out of the main arenas and into the tightest, most confined physical space on the tournament grounds, the organizers inadvertently created a massive pressure cooker. The Filipino fans did not politely petition the tournament directors to move the match to a larger stadium. They did not protest the official daily schedule. They simply used their sheer, undeniable physical presence to completely suffocate the space they were given. Every single square centimeter of ground outside that court was occupied. Fans were standing shoulder to shoulder, leaning heavily over the temporary barricades, hanging over the metal rails just to catch a fragmented glimpse of the baseline. Tournament security personnel, who are typically deployed to manage the massive, organized crowds around the top 10 players, were suddenly scrambling to reinforce the perimeter of a preliminary qualifier match. The metal fences were literally bowing inward from the collective, physical weight of the crowd. The organizers tried to use physical space to send a warning, to actively remind a young player of her low status in the brutal machinery of the sport. But the crowd simply took over that physical space and weaponized it. The cold, corporate decision to place her on an outside court was suddenly drowned out by the deafening roar of a national diaspora that absolutely refused to be pushed quietly to the margins. They turned the tournament's deliberate restriction into an undeniable, highly visible spectacle. By strictly enforcing the rules of the tennis hierarchy, the Italian Open accidentally exposed its own vulnerability. The system can control the broadcast cameras, the premium sponsors, and the locker room assignments. But the visual evidence on that outside court proved that they cannot control where the actual, beating heart of the audience decides to gather. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. As a new conscript, just trying to map out how the generals of this sport make their decisions, I know it is incredibly easy to see a deliberate tactical attack where there is only bureaucratic necessity. The generous reading here is that the Italian Open simply ran out of large courts. A Masters 1000 event in Rome is a massive, sprawling operational undertaking with hundreds of matches that must be completed within a strict window. The tournament directors have to juggle international broadcast obligations, potential weather delays, and a finite amount of premium real estate. You simply cannot put every single preliminary skirmish inside a fortified stadium. The organizers might have just looked at the spreadsheet, saw an unseeded qualifier from the Philippines, and assigned her the only open patch of dirt left on the grid. Both readings might be true at once. The officials might have simply been executing standard operating procedure without any malicious intent. But on the front lines of professional sports, the original intention behind a deployment ceases to matter the second the physical reality of the battlefield takes over. Regardless of why Alex Eala was placed on that specific, restricted court, the resulting image became an undeniable ultimatum. Think about what the tennis establishment actually saw that afternoon. They saw hundreds of people completely overrunning a designated peripheral zone. They saw a crowd crammed against an iron fence, holding the line, risking physical exhaustion just to watch an early round qualifying match. They saw their carefully structured environment, a system meticulously designed to keep the heavy noise strictly contained within the premium arenas, completely overwhelmed by a localized, kinetic force. This is exactly where the dynamic flips. The tournament initially used that cramped physical space to send Alex Eala a clear warning about her low rank and her lack of structural authority. But by aggressively occupying every single inch of that space, the Filipino diaspora sent a far more devastating warning directly back to the governing bodies of the sport. That warning is not a polite request for better seating next year. It is a fundamental, structural challenge to the very currency the sport operates on. As a new soldier looking at the terrain, the reality is obvious. The official WTA map says the center court is the only place that matters. But the crowd effectively stood at the outer barricades and declared, "You can keep your sterile algorithms. You can maintain your strict mathematical hierarchy. You own the ranking points, but we own the actual ground." That is a terrifying realization for an institution built on absolute top-down control. The tennis machine spends millions of dollars trying to artificially manufacture passion and market its highly ranked assets to the public. Yet, right on the fringes of their own heavily fortified facility, a massive, entirely unmanufactured wave of human energy was exploding for a player they deemed mathematically irrelevant. The system tried to bury the engagement in the smallest physical space available, but the crowd turned that tiny perimeter into the absolute center of gravity for the entire afternoon. My prediction is this, and I am going to commit to it. As a new recruit looking at the shifting front lines of this sport, I can see exactly where the next major structural conflict is going to happen. Within the next few seasons, the governing bodies of professional tennis are going to face these massive, uncontrollable spatial rebellions on a regular basis. As athletes from non-traditional tennis markets, particularly across Asia, continue to break through the qualification trenches, they are going to bring their entire national diasporas with them to these European tournaments. The established system will inevitably try to hold the line. They will continue to use physical space as a weapon of suppression, assigning these rising players to the absolute smallest, most heavily restricted outside courts, pointing to their official WTA ranking points as the ultimate justification. They can stubbornly choose to keep their colossal, premium center stadiums completely sterile and mathematically reserved strictly for the top seeds, even if those grandstands remain half-empty during the early rounds. But the visual truth from the Foro Italico cannot be unrecorded. The actual kinetic lifeblood of professional tennis is no longer sitting politely in the VIP boxes. It is boiling over right outside the chain-link fences. And eventually, the sheer physical weight of that demographic reality is going to forcefully snap the established hierarchy in half. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Should Masters 1000 tournaments be forced to dynamically adapt their physical spaces and immediately upgrade court assignments based strictly on localized crowd demand? Or is the brutal, mathematical hierarchy of those court assignments an absolute, essential part of the tennis machine? Come back to this video when the Asian hardcourt swing begins later this year, because everything we have discussed today about physical space and demographic power will either look prescient or look like overcautious noise. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The most interesting takes always end up at the top, so get in there. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.